All right, I think we can get started with chapter 6. You guys have been waiting for chapter 6 for a long time. And I ended up writing a lot of notes on 7. 6 is kind of short, but we'll work on 6 and then 7 a little bit. There is more yogurt if people want it. I just put it away so that it would stay long. It would stay better. There's also still blueberries and granola out. If you're wondering, the granola is a Costco one. They make it. It's called Ancient Grains or something, and there's a bunch of different stuff in it. It's full of fiber and good for you things, and not a lot of sugar. So it actually worked really well with the yogurt and the parfaits. So we're happy that you could enjoy that. They're leftovers from our campaign celebrations this last weekend. We had a little thing where we celebrated making our campaign goal. That was really good. And it was kind of fun to come together and to celebrate and to have a few things. Father Ross is the one that guessed on the amounts of food. And on some things, he was really, really close. And on other things, he was really, really far away. Father Ross eats fruit kind of like a monkey. And so he asked me to get 80 apples. And it doesn't sound like it's that many until you start looking at how big apples are. And even in these 4-pound tote things that they sell at like Sam's Club, there was only like 7 or 8 apples in each one. It's like, I have to buy like 10 or 12 of these? I only got 8 of them, and that was still more than we needed. They did a good job cutting them up and stuff, but they were, 80 apples is a lot. Sometime when you want to see how many it is, count them next time at the grocery store. And I was surprised. I thought, yeah, that sounds reasonable. And 32 pounds of apples was only about 50 apples. It was a very interesting time buying groceries because I had lots and lots and lots of things. Like, I bought packs of lunch meat, but I bought I think I got 5 of those, or 6 of them. It was just a different way of checking out. Usually you have a collection of stuff and about 8 gallons of orange juice and had cases of them, and it was kind of fun. Except not, because it got to be a long day. So the time period is that we're in. One of the things that the commentary brings out that I think is important is that some of this stuff is likely happening years later. The book of Acts makes it sound sort of like Jesus rose from the dead and ascended into heaven, and then they started preaching, and all of these things happened in short order. If you're following the story, it's happening that was just last chapter. But there's some evidence to suggest that this has been the description of several years' worth of effort. Now, we don't know exactly because ancient records aren't that accurate. Exactly when did the first persecution start, when Stephen dies, for instance? I think as nearly as we can tell, it's likely several years after the resurrection, but we don't really know. And so it's possible that this is an extended time frame in here, which makes sense because and I know that the work of evangelization and preaching doesn't happen very quickly. It's not something where you just preach a sermon once and that's the only thing that you have to do and then you go to the next place, right? People hear you once and they're like, oh yeah, I want to become a Christian, and they get baptized and then you never have to teach them again. I mean, it would be nice if that was the case, but I don't think ancient people were all that different from us, and there was a lot of work that needed to happen. And part of it is we've seen the rising tensions between the apostles and the Jewish leadership, the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the scribes. that there has been tension there. The apostles have been arrested several times. The angels have been breaking them out of prison. They've been doing those kind of things. And then today it talks about this conflict between the Hellenists and the Hebrews, or the Jewish people. And this is something that I think is very, very helpful, because there's more going on than it at first appears. So the Hellenists are likely Greek-speaking Jews. Does anyone know where the largest Greek-speaking city in the world was at this time? I'll give you a hint. It's not in Greece. Anyone? Be brave. I can't give you a chocolate. I gave them all away. But you could think of it getting like a spiritual chocolate. Jerusalem? That's a good guess, but no, not there. Nope. In Egypt, in Alexandria in Egypt. It's likely the largest city in the world at this point. It was a city of up to 1 million people. And it had the largest Jewish community outside of Israel, but there they spoke Greek. And that becomes important because in Alexandria they make a translation of the Hebrew Bible that's called the Septuagint, which sort of comes from the 70 scholars thing, that 70 Jewish scholars made this translation of the Hebrew Bible. But they use a Greek Bible. That becomes very, very important for the New Testament, because the New Testament is written in Greek. And when it quotes the Old Testament, it quotes that Bible from Alexandria, the Septuagint. And so that becomes the Bible that's familiar to the authors of the New Testament. And the Greek world, remember, is a world of poetry and playwrights and art and theater, marketplaces, those kinds of things. Not that there aren't cultural variations, but that's very much Greek language, Greek culture. You're living in that kind of world, and you're living as Jewish people there. What would be the major institution of Jewish life if you were a Jew in Alexandria? What would be the kind of place where you gathered? The synagogue. Exactly. The synagogue. So the synagogue would function much more, it would have a much stronger place in your life if you were a Greek-speaking Jew, because the temple was so far away. That was hard to get to. The Hebrews, this is a little bit of a misnomer, because the Hebrews are the people that were in Israel, but they mainly spoke a language called Aramaic. Aramaic, Aram, is the old name of Syria. So it means basically Old Syrian. And they spoke Aramaic. And their lives, they had synagogues as well, but their lives would be centered around the temple, because they lived in Israel and the temple was close by. And it's not that no one from Alexandria came to the temple. It's obvious that many people do, but just that the major institution is different. And the Jewish community in Israel had a Hebrew Bible. And then they had some Aramaic translations, and think of translations as being rather colorful. They're called the Targums, and they are translations, but sometimes embellishments. They're a little bit like fishing stories. So in the Hebrew Bible, it contains itself, and in the Targums and the Aramaic translations, they get a little bit bigger and grander and broad, like the fish grows, you know. It used to be this way, that the fish could grow on the way home. Well, how big was the fish that you caught? Oh, it was huge. I mean, you know, now you have a cell phone, and so the problem is that people actually have pictures of your fish. And then the fish don't grow. We have a new kind of fish today, and they don't grow on the way home anymore. But the Jewish community is a different cultural universe. Judaism was much more conservative than Greek culture. Conservative in the sense of preserving the past. Certainly, they did not have as much of the modern inventions. There were things that they were less comfortable with. And so what happens even in the Christian community over time is that the Hellenists, the Greek speakers, their widows are being neglected in the daily distribution. Widows are a special class, and it seems like the church kept a list of widows that it would support financially, because widows didn't have access to the same kinds of income that men did. Women could do some domestic things. Some of them weaved clothing. Some of them made cheese and did some of those kinds of things. But those trades weren't as well paying as men's trades. And this is one of the reasons why in so much of the Old Testament it talks about the widows and the orphans, people without parents, because it's very difficult to provide, and then aliens or foreigners, because they likely didn't speak the language, they don't know the culture, they have less access to it, and that's the same thing today. There are problems, for instance, that we face with illegal immigration in the United States, but even for legal immigrants, life can be hard. Some of them come here and they don't know a lot of English, and they don't end up getting good jobs. They work in the ways that they can, but they don't always have the education or the resources that you do if you're from the United States. And so that's still an issue. And so these widows are being neglected. The apostles, the people start complaining about it. Remember, church problems aren't new. They're very old. All the way in the very beginning, there's people complaining about something. And the apostles decide we need to address this, and so they call together the whole community. This is a little bit of the sense of like what the Synod for the Diocese of Fargo is. That we see the issues, we see the world changing around us, and something needs to be done. And it's not that the people in charge of the diocese have all of the ideas and know, there's not magic diocese dust that God gives you that sort of sorts out all the problems and what you need to do going forward. So the apostles model this. They call together the community and they begin a discussion. What should we do? And eventually it is decided to institute a new ministry in the life of the church. And so they say that as apostles, it is not right for us to neglect preaching the Word of God and neglect prayer. And I suspect it's particularly leading the prayers of the community. That it's not right for the apostles to neglect those things, because those are essential. Those are how the community's growing. But we need help with the temporal goods of the church. They need help with distributing the food. They need help with teaching and with ministry. And so they decide to institute the diaconate. And they say, choose 7 men from among yourselves. And the commentary notes that all 7 of them have Greek names, which likely means that they're from this Hellenist community. They're from this Greek-speaking community that in Israel was likely a minority. This wasn't the majority group. So they choose these men. They have to be of good repute. They can't just be the regular old village drunks. They have to be men who are striving to follow the Lord. Some of them may have been part of the community around Jesus for a long time. We don't know. But they choose 7 of them, and they lay hands on them. That's the ancient sign of ordination. And they institute this ministry. It gets its name because of a bunch of words that are all linked together in the text. They need help with serving people, and the word is diakonia in Greek. And it's also a verb, and this word comes up, diakonia, and the English word diaconate comes from that Greek word. It doesn't seem like they named them deacons right away. They name them as people who serve. And they get called deacons later because of that linguistic connection. They have to be guided by the Holy Spirit. They have to be wise. They have to have some wisdom. And their role is going to be to help in the administration of temporal goods. At least that's at first, but this is a little bit like you let the cat out of the farmhouse, and once the cat is out of the farmhouse, you don't know where the cat is going to go. Because what's fascinating is in the Acts of the Apostles, you can kind of feel the structure. So first it talked about apostles, and then they choose Matthias, and then it narrates a series of stories about apostles, and specifically about Peter and sometimes John. They're representatives of the apostles. Now it's going to bring up the ministry of deacons, and then guess what's going to happen? There's going to be a series of stories about the ministry of deacons, and it's going to pick two of them. The first one is Stephen, and he's going to die a martyr. He dies soon, poor Stephen. And then, or blessed Stephen, one of the two. And then they choose the second one that's narrated in the book of Acts is Philip. And so it will tell some of the stories about Philip. And you can see right away that Stephen preaches this giant sermon. That's more than just serving at table. These are men that are proving capable of entering into the ministry in a strong way. They assist in evangelization, in teaching and preaching. And this shows up immediately in the church fathers who are writing shortly after the New Testament was finished. Oh, we have a question. You win an award. I don't know what the award is. You can have an extra muffin. No, those are gone. You can have an extra cup of coffee.
Were the apostles using the temple as a place that they were getting all these works done?
That's a good question. So he's wondering, were they using the temple as a place where they were doing all of these things? And if you remember last week, we talked about them being in Solomon's portico, and that was part of the temple. So it seems like they definitely are gathering there and doing some things there. But we also know from the story that the temple is ruled by the Jewish leadership, and there's some antagonism between them. So I think it's likely that some of it is happening there. It's possible that by this point, maybe some wealthy people have donated an estate or allowed them to use a larger structure for something. But we don't really know. That's one of the things that's kind of clouded in mystery, is where are they actually at? And what are they using? And we don't know. That I feel like is the best answer I can give. They could be in the temple. They could be elsewhere. We do know that they were doing some things in their homes because it described that as well. Did you have a...
I do. I'm showing my ignorance here, but what is actually the difference between the temple and synagogue? Is it like the cathedral and then the church?
Okay, the difference between the temple and the synagogue. This one I think you guys can answer. The temple is the place where what is offered in the temple? Sacrifices. So for the most part, the biggest difference between the temple and the synagogue is that the temple is where the sacrifices have to take place. So in some ways it might feel a little bit like the cathedral in a parish, but in this case it's kind of a different form of worship. In both places they have prayers. In both places they have they would have services for people to gather. But in the temple, those are centered around the sacrificial offerings, so bulls and goats and sheep and grain and doves and those kind of things. And in the synagogue, the worship is centered around the scriptures. Because you can't, in Judaism, you can only offer sacrifices in the temple. So the scriptural services were more in the synagogue. Not that they didn't do them in the temple, they did, but the temple is sort of like synagogue plus. You're the gold star members of Judaism because you have the things at the synagogue, but you also have the sacrifices. The other biggest difference is that the priesthood is connected to which one? The priesthood is connected to the temple because it's connected to the sacrifices. So the priests and the Levites are in the temple, although they would probably go to synagogues as well. But what's the name of the leaders of synagogues? Rabbi. So rabbis lead synagogues, and for the most part, you can think of the synagogues as being the primary domain of the Pharisees. The Pharisees are sort of like rabbis. They're the ones trying to be holy. They're immersed in the Word of God and in their traditions. At the temple, the people in charge are the Sadducees. And that most of the priests are Sadducees. They belong to that group. There are some Pharisees. Then we have this group called the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is sort of the high Jewish court of appeal that makes decisions and issues legally binding things. The Sanhedrin likely included some Pharisees, but probably mostly Sadducees, because it's connected with the temple. The Sanhedrin has a room in the temple complex that they meet in. I think it's called the Sanhedrin room. It's really creative. It might have a special Jewish name. But there's another group kind of wandering around. The Zealots are there, but they kind of disappear from history. But there's one more group that has some priests, but they're kind of weird. Remember, they're the Essenes. They live out mostly in the desert, but there's an Essene quarter in Jerusalem. And the house of the Last Supper, the traditional site of the Last Supper, is in the Essene quarter. And that seems to have become a center of the early Christian missions in Jerusalem, that they gathered and lived much more so in the Essene quarter. And the Essenes included some priests from the temple, maybe some who were Sadducees, maybe some who were Pharisees, but they took a very different approach to things. They rejected most of the temple worship because they said the temple has become corrupted because the high priesthood gets tied up in politics and becomes a political office and not a spiritual one. So the temple gets kind of iffy because it's like it gets combined with the state. It gets combined with political power. And that makes it more of a challenge. Does that make sense? Oh, we have another question.
Why 7?
Why 7?
7 deacons.
Oh, because 7 is the number of completeness. 7 is the number of completeness. Something is finished when you have 7 of them. When something's incomplete, how many do you have? 6. It's the way Jewish numbers work. And 7 is one of God's numbers, but it's because God created the world in 7 days. You can see that, you can feel it. Like weeks, organizing the year into weeks of 7 days is biblical. That's where it comes from. The Romans didn't have weeks. They had a first part of the month and a second part of the month, but that was kind of it. And you didn't get like a holiday of 2 days every weekend and work for 5 days during the week. Lots of them in Roman times worked for 14 days in a row, and then the 15th was usually a holiday, so they had that one off. I think it was like the 15th and the 30th or something like that, the end of the month. But 7 becomes a number of completeness. And so it makes you wonder, is it possible that there were more than 7? Yes, because 7, the Jews use numbers differently. 7 is the number of completeness. But it also doesn't mean that there weren't 7, because they list 7 names. I'm not exactly sure why they didn't pick 12, because 12 tribes would have made sense, but as far as we can tell, they didn't. Although, one thing that's fascinating is it says that they ordained these 7 men to the diaconate in this initial thing. But you could ask a question, how many deacons are there? And the answer is, you don't know. Because it doesn't say that they didn't ordain anyone else to the diaconate. It just says that they ordained these 7. And that distinction is important because very, very quickly we're going to start getting into there's other people doing things and leading services, and there's this group of the elders that shows up. The word for elders is presbyters, presbyteroi, which is where priest comes from. There's an linguistic link between those. And so it's very possible that they ordain more than 7 deacons. They may have ordained 7 in the first set and ordained 7 more the next day. But the things are held up sort of as examples or paradigms, as a pattern of the way that it works. So the community is continuing to expand. They need more services and leaders because the apostles can't do everything. So right now, the church looks like the apostles, plus the deacons, plus the group of the faithful. Priests are going to get added shortly in a little bit when the apostles can't be everywhere. And then Stephen gets accused. And the story of Stephen is a lot like Jesus. Stephen is filled with grace and power. They say that about Jesus. He grows in wisdom and in grace when he goes back with his parents to Nazareth and is obedient to them. There's an escalating tension in the book. Stephen's going to die. It's no longer just someone's being arrested. It's now the tension is increased to the point where they're committing or carrying out capital punishment. So he preaches in the synagogue of freedmen. These are likely former slaves who lived in the area of Jerusalem, but they are probably also Jews from outside of Israel. Maybe he was preaching in Greek. They debate Stephen, but Stephen's winning the arguments. They can't sustain the debate because the Messiah looks too much like Jesus, and the people are starting to drift. And so the leadership gets worried. So they bring forward these false witnesses, and there's 2 false witnesses, or there's 2 accusations, kind of like the people who accused Jesus. Remember, there's false accusations against Jesus. It very much wants to show Stephen being like Jesus. They stir up the elders and the scribes and the people. They're uniting the groups against them. There's been this debate happening in Judaism, what to do about this Jesus guy. And the apostles are preaching in synagogues. Jews are starting to follow Christianity. They're starting to believe he's God. And now they're able to unite the groups against Stephen. And that's going to be kind of the watershed moment. He's arrested and taken before the Sanhedrin. And they accuse him of preaching against the law and the temple. Those are the 2 major institutions of Jewish life. In a way, you could say he's preaching against the synagogue and the temple. He's preaching against the customs of Moses. Moses would be claimed very much by the Pharisees. All our rules are from Moses. Moses, Moses, Moses. Because Moses is the founder of the nation. Moses is the one that makes the pattern, the paradigm covenant with the people of God at Mount Sinai. Remember how I told you that thing's going to keep coming up? It really does. And so they look at Stephen intently and they wait for an answer. But it actually says, the text says that Stephen has a radiant face, which is like Moses. When Moses was up on the mountain, he didn't realize that his face had started glowing, and so he ends up putting on a veil or covering his face when he comes down because of this glowing face. And so what it's showing is that Stephen is like Moses. That's going to be a major piece of what's coming. And Stephen is like Moses also because Stephen is like Jesus. And it's showing that God is giving this testimony to support Stephen, that his face is glowing. None of us, despite our best efforts, and despite how many ads you see about makeup and Neutrogena this and retinol that, they can't make your face glow. They can make you look nicer a little bit, it's true, but they can't make your face glow. And they don't make you look like they do in the commercials. That's airbrush and Photoshop and whatever else they use. So God's giving testimony to this. It's important that we see that, like, this message of Christianity provokes a response, and the response is one of hostility on the part of some people. Now, it's not everyone who's listening that's hostile, but at least some of the people in charge. And this, I think, is important for us to hear, because we live in a time and an age where it's looking increasingly like persecution is possible, maybe even becoming more likely. And I think it's hard for them in the moment. I don't think Stephen goes into this and is like, yes, I'm excited, I'm arrested. I think he probably trembled a little bit, because you do. Like, it's not easy to be in this kind of position, but he also chooses to put his faith in God. Jesus promises that he will give them the words to speak in those kind of situations. And he's arrested specifically for the faith, not because he did something wrong, but because he was preaching about the message of Jesus. That's important. It's different when you've done something wrong and you're hauled before a court accused of a crime. Some things are actually criminal. There's a guy in Great Britain right now, and the accusation against him is that he might have been praying in front of an abortion clinic. No, well, the one I'm thinking of, he wasn't, maybe he was a priest. But the Brits have these weird rules about, they somehow have, you can't even pray within X number of feet of an abortion clinic, which is kind of ridiculous and on the face a clear violation of the freedom of speech, but welcome to the modern world. And the court case is actually rather funny against him, because they're like, well, he may have been praying while he was walking around. They admit that he didn't talk to anyone, that he wasn't praying out loud, but they're trying to criminalize the fact that he was praying in his head, which is very, very threatening to do. I mean, for people that don't believe in God, that's really odd to say. You are threatened by someone walking by who might be praying. Oh, that's terribly threatening. I mean, the Russians aren't threatening, they're shooting missiles at you, but the guy who prays is. Go figure. Welcome to the modern world. We live in a strange age. And so Stephen begins his defense. This is on page 47. He begins to address these false accusations. And he starts by going back to Abraham. Why Abraham? Why not Fred, the high priest?
Abraham was the father of all the Jews.
Abraham is the father of all the Jews, and where is Stephen speaking?
In the Jewish temple.
In the Jewish temple in front of